The wind blew hard in Willows Creek that night. The branches of the tall trees smacked against each other, the sound echoing like a wail through the small town tucked away in the mountains. But to 8-year-old Tommy Grayson, the sound seemed like an invitation. He slipped out of the house quietly, slipping through the back door while his parents slept. His eyes were glazed over, fixed on an invisible point in the darkness. Standing barefoot, the boy made his way along the trail that led into the woods. The cold ground seemed to have no effect on him, and he murmured strange words, almost like a song in a forgotten language. The forest enveloped him, and the outside world disappeared. When he reached the clearing, the pale glow of a full moon illuminated a stone altar in the center. Covered in moss and carved with ancient markings, the altar seemed to pulse with a sinister energy. And it was there that a figure appeared, tall, thin, and pale as death itself. Intense red eyes stared at Tommy as the creature raised a skeletal hand toward him. A blood-curdling scream cut through the night. However, no one heard it. The next morning, Willows Creek would wake up to face one of the greatest mysteries in its history. The next morning, Margaret Grayson opened Tommy's bedroom door to wake him for school. The bed was empty, the sheets rumpled. At first, she thought he was in the bathroom or playing in the backyard, but when she called several times and received no answer, panic began to rise in her chest. "David! Tommy's not here!" she shouted to her husband, who quickly put down his coffee and ran to his son's room. The search began immediately. Margaret scoured the area around the house, asking neighbors if they had seen Tommy. Within hours, almost the entire neighborhood had gathered, and Sheriff Hank Lambert was called to organize the search. "He might have gotten lost in the woods," Hank said as he organized a group with flashlights and sniffer dogs. The Willows Creek Forest had a reputation for being treacherous. Many people avoided entering it, especially at night, because of the legends surrounding it. But despite their collective efforts, no sign of Tommy was found that day. Only a dirty sneaker was discovered next to a trail, as if it had been hastily torn off. Margaret couldn't sleep. She spent her nights looking out the window, hoping to see her son returning along the dirt road. David tried to comfort his wife, but he himself was on the verge of collapse. Meanwhile, Emily, Tommy's younger sister, began to have nightmares. She saw her brother walking through the forest, followed by a tall, thin shadow. "He's there, in the forest," the girl would tell her mother. But Margaret wouldn't listen. As the days passed without any news of Tommy, Hank decided to dig deeper into the historical records of Willows Creek. The small town had been founded in the 17th century by settlers fleeing religious persecution. However, the early years were marked by mysterious deaths and a shortage of resources. Hank found records of a pact made by the settlers with an entity known as the Pale One. In desperation, the founders of Willows Creek had offered human sacrifices in exchange for prosperity and protection. The forest, according to legend, was the domain of the entity, which demanded a child every generation in payment. Although the pact had been abandoned over the years, child disappearances continued to occur sporadically in the town. Hank found mention of similar cases from the 1920s to the 1970s, but none of them were solved. Margaret did not want to believe the legends were connected to her son's disappearance, but Emily continued to describe terrifying dreams. "He's trapped there," the girl would say, "and the white man wants him forever." Emily began drawing pictures of the things she saw in her nightmares: the stone altar, Tommy's face, and a tall, thin figure with red eyes. The drawings were too detailed for a child of only 7. Terrified, Margaret took the drawings to Hank, who became even more convinced that something supernatural was happening. One night, Emily woke up screaming. Margaret ran to her daughter's room and found her shaking with fear. "Mommy," Emily said, "he called me. He said it was my turn." Margaret began to realize that Emily was also being drawn to the entity. She decided that she could no longer wait for answers. She had to act. Together with Hank, she gathered a small group of villagers willing to enter the forest again. When the group entered the forest, the air seemed different. It was completely silent, except for the sound of footsteps on the trail. With every meter they advanced, The feeling that they were being watched intensified. After hours of walking, they reached the clearing depicted in the drawings, Emily. The altar was there, just as the girl had described. Claw marks were etched into the stone, and the smell of blood permeated the air. Suddenly, one of the group began to scream. "I see things! They're here!" He ran into the darkness, disappearing into the trees. The others didn't have time to react before shadows began to move around them. Hank yelled for everyone to run, but the shadows were fast and relentless. An invisible force seemed to separate the group. Margaret found herself alone facing the altar, and for a brief moment, she thought she heard Tommy's voice. "He's close," the voice in her head said. She ran back to town, where she found Hank, the only other survivor of the expedition. They both knew they couldn't face whatever was in the woods without more information and a clear strategy. After their failed attempt to explore the forest, Margaret and Hank began to realize that Emily was becoming the focus of the entity. The girl became more and more withdrawn, her drawings more disturbing, and her eyes showed a strange maturity for her age. One night, Emily began to talk in her sleep. Margaret entered her daughter's room and found the girl sitting up in bed, her eyes closed, mumbling in the same language Tommy had spoken before he disappeared. "Emily, what's happening to you?" Margaret asked, terrified. The girl opened her eyes, but her expression was cold, almost as if someone else were looking at her mother. "He wants me to come," Emily said in a tone that didn't seem like her own. "He wants me to take him to you." Margaret backed away, trembling, while Emily lay back down as if nothing had happened. Her mother decided she could no longer stand by and do nothing. Hank, who was also obsessed with solving the case, suggested consulting Eleanor, a local elder known for her knowledge of the stories and myths of Willows Creek. Eleanor lived in isolation in an old house on the side of the mountain. When Margaret and Hank arrived, she was hesitant to let them in. "You have stirred something that should have been forgotten," the woman said, looking at them both suspiciously. After much insistence, Eleanor let them in and revealed the truth. The pact between the settlers and the Pale One was more than just a legend. According to her, the entity was inextricably linked to the land of Willows Creek, feeding on human fear and suffering. "It demands innocent blood," Eleanor explained, "and the pact can only be broken by those who have the courage to confront it directly. But that comes at a cost." Margaret asked what cost meant, but Eleanor refused to explain. Instead, she handed them an ancient book filled with forgotten symbols and rituals. Hank began to study the book, while Margaret tried to protect Emily, who seemed more vulnerable by the day. With the help of the book, Hank discovered a ritual that could summon the Pale One to neutral ground, far from the clearing and the altar. They would need Tommy's personal belongings, a piece of the altar, and most dangerously, someone willing to be used as an anchor, a person who would directly confront the entity to establish communication. Margaret volunteered without hesitation, but Hank warned her. "This could be worse than anything you can imagine." On the night of the ritual, Margaret, Hank, and a small group of villagers set up a protective circle near the entrance to the forest. Emily, against her mother's wishes, insisted on being present. As they began to recite the words from the book, the air grew heavy and dense. The wind died, and the forest fell into absolute silence. Then he appeared. The Pale One was more terrifying than any description. His gaunt, disproportionate figure seemed to change shape every second, as if he were made of shadow and flesh at the same time. His eyes, two glowing red holes, fixed on Margaret. "What do you want here, mortal?" The entity's voice sounded in all directions at once, deep and echoing. "I want my son back!" Margaret cried, tears streaming down her face. The Pale One smiled, revealing needle-thin teeth. "Your son was given as payment, but perhaps I can bargain. What will you offer in return?" Margaret hesitated. Before she could answer, Emily stepped forward. "Take me instead." "No!" Margaret cried, grabbing her daughter by the shoulders. The Pale One tilted his head, puzzled. "This child's courage is fascinating, but it's not that simple," One life for another? It's not enough. I want more. The wind began to blow again, this time bringing dark whispers. Margaret knew the bargain was getting complicated. As the confrontation unfolded, Hank realized something important in the book. The Pale One had a weak point. He could only be defeated within the clearing where the altar was located, for that was where his weapon was located. Their connection to the human world was stronger, and therefore more vulnerable. He whispered his discovery to Margaret while he distracted the entity. They decided to interrupt the ritual, retreating to plan a final strategy. Before they left, however, the Pale One issued a warning. If you return without an offering, I will take you all! Back in town, Margaret and Hank decided they needed to act immediately. They gathered a group of volunteers again, but few had the courage to return to the forest after their encounter. With flashlights, the ancient book, and rudimentary weapons, they set out for the clearing the following night. Emily insisted on going again. I am the key, she said, with a conviction that was frightening for a child. Margaret was reluctant, but eventually allowed it. When they reached the altar, the Pale One was already waiting for them, surrounded by the shadows that served him. I thought you wouldn't come back, the entity said, his voice dripping with disdain. Hank began to recite the words from the book, while Margaret positioned Emily in the circle of protection. The clearing seemed to pulse with energy, and the shadows advanced, trying to break the circle. It was then that Emily began to mutter something that was not in the book. Her voice, once again, seemed to belong to someone else. The altar began to glow, and the Pale One retreated, screaming in rage. The glow of the altar intensified as Emily recited words that were incomprehensible but charged with an ancient power. Margaret tried to reach out to stop her, fearing that her daughter was being consumed by the entity, but Hank held her back. Don't touch her. Something is happening. She knows what she's doing, Hank said, his eyes fixed on the scene. The Pale One, who had seemed unshakable before, was now weakened, his shadows dissipating. The creature advanced and retreated like a cornered animal. Stop it! The entity shouted, its voice reverberating through the forest. Emily opened her eyes, which now glowed an intense golden hue. You no longer belong here, she said, her voice not her own but carrying authority. The trees around the clearing began to twist, roots emerging from the ground and entangling the figure of the Pale One. The entity screamed in agony as the altar exploded with light. Suddenly, Emily turned to Margaret. Mother, I need to finish this, but you can't stop me, Margaret cried, begging her daughter not to do anything dangerous. Emily, however, seemed resigned. She approached the altar, touched the stone with her small hands, and began to chant one last chant. The ground of the clearing cracked, revealing a darkness that seemed to have no end. The Pale One was dragged inside, his claws trying to hold on to the altar. But what happened next left everyone stunned. A spectral form emerged from the abyss. It was Tommy. Tommy! Margaret cried, running toward her son, who now seemed to be floating between the world of the living and the dead. I can't stay, Mom, Tommy said, sadness in his eyes. But Emily can end this. Margaret tried to hold her son, but he disappeared in a burst of light. The Pale One let out one last roar before being completely consumed by the darkness of the ground, and then the clearing fell into absolute silence. When it was all over, Emily fainted next to the altar. Margaret and Hank carried her back to the house, fearing the worst, but the girl woke up the next morning, apparently without remembering anything. The forest had changed. There was no longer that sense of imminent danger, and the animals began to return. However, Margaret could not shake the feeling that the price had been too high. As the weeks passed, Emily continued to draw. But now, her drawings showed peaceful scenes, a family together, a clear sky over the forest. Margaret tried to believe that the nightmare was over, but there was something in her daughter's eyes that made her uneasy. One night, Emily called her mother into her room. "Mommy, he's still here!" the girl whispered, pointing to a dark corner of the room. Margaret saw nothing, but she felt the presence, a shiver that ran down her spine. "Who's here, honey?" Emily hesitated before answering. Tommy, he's not trapped, but he can't leave yet. Margaret's heart raced. Emily explained that by defeating the Pale One, she had brought Tommy back in part. He was now a guardian of sorts, watching over the forest so that the entity could not return. Margaret knew she should feel relief, but she couldn't ignore the weight of her daughter's words. The forest, though peaceful for now, still carried a remnant of the Dark Pact. Years passed, and Willows Creek became a quiet town again. Margaret and Hank rebuilt their lives, but they never forgot the events they had endured. Emily grew up to be an introspective and creative young woman, but with an unbreakable bond. The forest was familiar to Margaret. Often she would be found sitting at the edge of the trees, staring into the distance as if waiting for something or someone. And then, one cold autumn night, Emily disappeared. In the place where she had usually sat, Margaret found a single drawing left behind. It showed Emily walking beside Tommy, both smiling, as distant shadows watched them from afar. Margaret knew she would never see her again, but she also understood that her daughter had chosen her destiny to protect Willows Creek forever. The legend of the Pale One became just a memory, passed down from generation to generation as a cautionary tale. But the elders still say that if you walk through the woods on a moonless night, you can hear the whispers of two children, watching over evil never to return. And in the heart of the forgotten glade, the altar stands untouched, a grim reminder of the pact that nearly destroyed the town. And of course, if you like this content, don't forget to like, subscribe, and activate the bell to receive notifications.